These slides are a summary of material from Bauman's Microbiology, Chapter 2, The Chemistry of Life. In these slides, we're going to cover a couple of basic definitions of chemistry and talk about what happens when we bring different atoms together and form bonds between them, and talk about some of the basic chemical reactions that are very important for life. Okay, some definitions. The basic unit of all matter is the atom. Atoms are composed of a nucleus which contains protons and neutrons. Protons determine what the atom's actual properties are and have a charge of +1. Neutrons are uncharged, but are approximately the same size as protons. Electrons are found surrounding the nucleus of the atom and have a charge of -1. And it's the number of protons and the number of electrons that give an individual atom its charge. If we look at any type of matter, and it's composed of atoms of all the same kind, those are atoms that have exactly the same number of protons in each one, we refer to this type of matter as elemental. We can bring together atoms to form compounds of more than one atom. These are referred to as molecules, and if we bring different kinds of atoms together to form bonds between them, we refer to these as compounds. We'll spend a little bit of time now talking about some of the different ways that we can bring atoms together. Atoms of the same element or atoms of different elements can be brought together to form bonds between them. These will create either molecules or compounds if the atoms are different. We'll talk about three different kinds of bonds that we can form between atoms. Covalent bonds, which come in really two different types, and ionic bonds. Covalent bonds and ionic bonds are both strong bonds. And then we'll talk about a third type of bond that can be formed between different compounds called hydrogen bonds, which are distinct from the other two in that they are typically very weak. Bonds form between atoms because the atoms will interact with one another. Typically, this interaction is going to occur because electrons are shared between the different atoms. And the way that the electrons are shared are determined by the individual properties of the atoms with their electronegativity. Electronegativity refers to the tendency of an individual atom to either attract or lose its electrons. In this slide, we have an example of electrons being shared between two different kinds of atoms that are going to form covalent bonds between them. In the upper example, we have a hydrogen atom and a carbon atom. Each of them have a nucleus with protons and neutrons, which determine what type of element they are, and electrons, which circle around the nucleus. The two atoms have interacted with one another over here on the right to form a methane molecule, and you can see that there are 4 atoms of hydrogen circling around one atom of carbon, and pairs of electrons are being shared around each of the hydrogen atoms. The covalent bonds in which the electrons are being shared equally are very strong and are referred to as a non-polar covalent bond. In the bottom example, we have, again, a hydrogen atom, actually 2 hydrogen atoms, and an oxygen atom. The electron pairs are not shared equally between the 2 atoms in this example, and in fact the electrons in the covalent bond tend to be pulled towards the oxygen atom. This creates a molecule in which the electrons are unequally shared between them, and the electrons tend to gather towards the oxygen atom. This is going to create a situation where we end up having a net negative charge on this molecule towards the more electronegative atom, and a net positive charge at the end of the molecule where there is fewer electrons being shared in the pair. Please note that this molecule is not actually charged, it's just that there is an apparent charge because of the unequal sharing of the electrons. Here we have a different type of strong bond that's being formed between two different atoms. In this example, we are looking at the formation of an ionic bond. And ionic bonds are going to form between atoms of very different electronegativities. In our example up here, we have a sodium atom and a chlorine atom. And if we refer back to a periodic table, we'll note that sodium and chlorine are at opposite sides, left and right, of the periodic table. This means that they have very different electronegativities. What happens when we have a situation like this, the chlorine atom, over here on the right, steals away an electron from the sodium atom. This makes it so that the chlorine atom has a full set of electrons orbiting around its nucleus. But the end result of this is that the chlorine atom now has one more electron than it does protons. This means that this atom is now going to be charged with a negative charge because of the excess number of electrons. That electron that goes to fill up the orbital in the chloride ion over here came from the sodium atom, and as a result, the sodium atom has one fewer electrons than it does protons, and as a result, now has a net positive charge. The charged versions of these two atoms, sodium and chloride, are now referred to as ions. And because they're charged, these two ions can now interact with one another to form an ionic bond. Ionic bonds are very strong and can form very strong interactions in a molecule. However, when water or some other solute is present, the individual ions in an ionic compound can dissociate or ionize, where the separate ions become dissociated from one another. All right, and here's our third type of bond that we can form between different atoms, and these are referred to as hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds also involve sharing between them to form them. However, unlike covalent bonds or ionic bonds, they're typically very weak in comparison. Here we can see an example of hydrogen bonds forming between two compounds, the compound cytosine and the compound guanine. Both of these we'll see later are part of the building blocks of nucleic acids. And we can see that the hydrogen atom in this guanine molecule over here is interacting with the oxygen atom over here. Now please remember that hydrogen and oxygen have different electronegativities. This oxygen over here, although it's not charged, does tend to have more electrons than the carbon atom. We formed a polar covalent bond over here in the cytosine molecule. Likewise, we have a polar covalent bond over here between this hydrogen and nitrogen. The hydrogen over here tends to have a net positive charge, and it's the interaction between the net negative on this oxygen and the net positive over here on the hydrogen that allows the hydrogen bond to form between these two separate molecules. Although hydrogen bonds are very weak in comparison to ionic bonds and covalent bonds, they're absolutely critical for the formation of bonds in biomolecules. Because they're weak, they will be able to be broken much more easily than the other two kinds of bonds. Let's talk a little bit about the process of forming or breaking bonds between different molecules or atoms. Chemical reactions can basically be summarized in two different types: synthesis reactions, in which bonds are put together, and decomposition reactions, where bonds are broken. Here we see an example of a synthesis reaction where two separate reactants are brought together and combined. Bonds are created in here, and in this example we have a molecule of water, molecules of carbon dioxide, and bonds are created here to form a molecule of glucose. The process of this reaction requires energy in order to form the bonds in glucose, and as a result, this energy requiring reaction is referred to as an endothermic reaction. Synthesis reactions such as this in living cells are referred to in total as anabolic pathways. Anabolism refers to the process of forming and bringing together molecules to make them larger. Now we can also take molecules and break bonds between them to make them smaller. In this reaction, a decomposition reaction, we see a molecule of glucose. Bonds in molecule of glucose are broken to create water and carbon dioxide. This process actually liberates energy, and energy is released from the reaction. We refer to this type of a reaction as an exothermic reaction. Now, just because we've labeled these two reactions, the synthesis reaction is endothermic and the decomposition reaction is exothermic, this does not necessarily mean that all synthesis reactions are endothermic or require energy, or all decomposition reactions release energy. It actually depends upon the type of reaction and what the reactants are in each individual reaction that determines whether or not energy is required or energy is released. Please note in each of the examples, the synthesis reaction or the decomposition reaction, that the number of each of the atoms on the left side and the right side of the reaction is equal to 1. Now here are two examples of some of the previous synthesis reactions and decomposition reactions that we just saw. One super common type of synthesis reaction is a reaction known as a dehydration synthesis. And in a dehydration synthesis, two small molecules are brought together, and in the process of forming the new chemical bond between small molecule 1 and small molecule 2, a molecule of water is liberated from the reaction. So water is formed as the chemical bond between this OH and H occurs. A specific example of a dehydration synthesis reaction is where two molecules, such as two amino acids, are brought together in order to form a protein molecule. And dehydration synthesis is very, very common in biological pathways. The opposite of a dehydration synthesis reaction is the process of hydrolysis. Here we can see a large molecule, and water is also necessary as a reactant. Water attacks one of the bonds in the larger molecule and breaks that bond, liberating two smaller molecule products. In our protein synthesis example above, if we were to take a protein and start breaking it up back into individual amino acids, the individual amino acids would be produced from a hydrolysis reaction. Again, hydrolysis reactions are very, very common in biological pathways. Here we have a third type of reaction, an exchange reaction. In an exchange reaction, we have two reactants, and bonds are exchanged between the two reactants to form two separate products. A specific example is the molecule glucose and the molecule adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. When a phosphate from adenosine triphosphate is transferred over to glucose, we form a glucose phosphate molecule and adenosine diphosphate. If we look at a living cell and look at the sum total of all of the anabolic, or building up reactions, and catabolic, or breaking down reactions, and exchange reactions in that individual cell, we refer to the sum total of all those reactions by the term metabolism.